Okay, we've gone through the structure of the American political process in quite a bit detail by now. Yet there are other things not a part of our government that are a part of our government. That is to say, they're not necessarily part of the original Constitution. They're not in one of the articles of the Constitution. They don't have anything to do with elections or political parties in a certain sense. They're not what you would normally think of as having to do with the running of American government, but yet they have a tremendous impact on the American political process. And the one I'm going to talk about right here is the role of the media. The role of the media is something that has always been a part of the American political process, but maybe not in quite as dramatic a way as it is today. Often people complain about the liberal media, or they look at the media as being biased. And so one of the things we have to learn is that the media was supposed to be biased. If you go back to the founding of our country, the very first political party system with those Federalists and Democratic Republicans, each of those political parties in every town and city had a newspaper whose intention was to advocate for that political party. It was very easy to know which paper to buy. You would buy the Santa Clarita Democrat or the Santa Clarita Republican, and whichever political party you espoused, and the news would be shifted or spun, to use a term from our day, in such a way as to advocate the views of that party. So again, if you're happening to buy today the Santa Clarita Democrat, it would talk about the great successes of President Obama and how things are going just the way he planned and all of that. And if you're buying the Santa Clarita Democrat, the news would be spun to show you that, well, these plans aren't working as well as they should be, and oh, if only there was a Republican president in 2016. So that's the original intent. So we shouldn't be surprised if the media is biased. It was supposed to be, and it was for a very long time. The media was essentially newspapers. That was the media for the first 150 years of our country's history. And newspapers in the founding, for the first 100 of those years, were expensive. You couldn't really just have those on every street corner because it costs a lot to make newspapers. Media takes a great leap forward in the Industrial Revolution in the 1880s and 90s with the invention of what's called the penny press. Newspapers become mass-produced, and they are very, very cheap. They're out on every street corner. This is the pictures you've seen, I'm sure, of the little newsboys screaming extra, extra, because you could put out edition after edition every day to update the news every 6 or 12 hours if you'd like. What this meant was that there was more news available, that the political parties had to adapt their strategies for that. And again, to manipulate the news, to keep people, keep their appetites whetted for the next news story became something that politicians and political parties in general had to do. Well, the national media's next step was in the 1920s. In the 1920s, we still have newspapers, of course, but now we have radio. And radio meant that you would judge a candidate, whether it's president or whoever it might be, by their voice. It was no longer some speech you might read printed in word for word in some newspaper. It was no longer maybe a photograph that you would see that had been telegraphed over, but it would be their actual voice. And the president that begins to use this to great advantage is Franklin Roosevelt. He is the president during the American Depression and World War II, and he is extraordinary as a public speaker. He had a very beautiful voice, it exuded confidence, and at a time when America is at the depths of the Depression, it was just what Americans wanted to hear, pun intended. They wanted to hear a voice that was reassuring, they wanted to hear a voice that exuded that confidence that let them know everything was going to be all right. And Roosevelt played to that. He played to that with these fireside chats, where every few weeks he would come on the radio and just have a conversation just like I'm talking to you, not some formal State of the Union address, but a conversation. He would use colloquial phrases, he was informal, and you just got the feeling that he was sitting right there, sitting next to you at your fireside, just sort of unburdening himself and bringing you up to date on the future of America. He played it wonderfully. Well, the next big media burst is television, and television changes so much. It goes from now what people hear to what people see. And the key election that inaugurated this was the election of 1960. In the election of 1960, the two candidates are Robert F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was a Republican candidate. He had been vice president under Dwight Eisenhower for the last 8 years. He was experienced, and he was the mature man to beat. John Kennedy was young, 43 at the time. He is young, he is handsome, he is striking, he is somewhat untrained and somewhat inexperienced, but he brings youth and vigor. Well, they had exchanged a variety of different kinds of campaign slogans and things like that coming up, but the crucial moment in that election came with a televised debate, the first televised debate. And Nixon, going into this debate, clearly had the lead in all the polls. In this debate, John Kennedy wore a blue blazer. Now, it is only black and white, but the image I want you to get is he wore on a blue blazer, which is going to come out very dark. And he had just been tanned, he had darker hair, and he was against a sort of light camel-colored background, and he stood out wonderfully. If you see old videos, you can YouTube this, you see old videos, he just cut a very distinctive profile. Richard Nixon, however, had a very light brown suit, which just blended in, unfortunately, with the background behind him. Also, not to be president, not in this election, but Vice President Nixon had also just been recovering from knee surgery. He'd lost some weight, he looked a little pale, he insisted on his own makeup man, and it was not coming off good. Those who heard the debate on radio felt that the debate was pretty much a draw. Maybe even Nixon got in the better conversation. But those who saw the debate on TV unanimously thought Kennedy won. This changed the way people viewed TV because candidates began to realize it is no longer going to be how you're heard, but how you're seen. And the fact that Kennedy won that debate in terms of those who saw it changed the polls, and Kennedy will go on to win the 1960 election. And ever since then, television has made or broken presidential candidates. You've got to be good today. You have to be physically able to stand in front of a camera. You've got to be able to carry yourself well. You've got to get those sound bites out. If you can't sell it in front of a camera, you can't be elected. Well, that's a little bit of the history of the media. What are some rules, or how does the media actually work? There are rules that govern this, and one of the rules is confidentiality. This means that there is a sort of a unwritten rule, if you will, between a political official or a candidate and the media covering them of things that we say that you can print or not print. And here's how this kind of breaks down. If I'm the political candidate and you're interviewing me and I say something is on the record, what that means is that you can quote me. You can say, this person said this. That's on the record, that's for public consumption. But what if I want to say something but not have it attributed to me by name? This is what's called on background. If I say it's on background, what that means is that you can print it, but you can't say I'm the one who said it. You have to say something along the line of, again, we'll give you an example, not using myself, but using what really happens in the world. Say the White House, say President Obama has an idea that he thinks this might be a good plan, but he doesn't want to go out there and say it's his plan in case people don't like it. He might have a White House spokesperson make this statement, and so it would read in the paper that a White House spokesperson or an aide close to the president is saying that this is what might be happening. Then, if the idea is good and people say, oh, that's a great idea, now the president can step in and say, yeah, that was me. If it turns out it's not a good idea and people don't like it, then he can say, oh, I don't know what that person was talking about. It gives you a chance to distance yourself until you see which way the wind is blowing. That's called on background. On deep background means you can print it, but you can't attribute it to anybody. You have to sort of take the responsibility yourself for this. Reporters don't like that. They don't like the fact that they have to put down, the interest rates are going to be lowered, but I can't tell you how I know that. That's something they don't like. And then the last one is off the record. And this is something that candidates actually will do simply to satisfy the curiosity of a reporter without having to worry about whether or not it's going to be printed. So they would say, this is off the record, so I'm going to tell you so you can know, but I don't ever want to see it in print. Now, you might think, well, couldn't a reporter print it anyway? Of course they could, but they're only going to do it once, because from then on, some political office holder or candidate will never trust them again. Well, there are other rules that apply, rules like besides confidentiality. One is equal time. This applies to mostly today not newspapers, but radio and television, in that if you give one candidate a certain amount of time free to make a speech, you have to give their opponent the same time. That's something that applies in terms of elections, as elections are coming near. Now, one advantage that people in office have, for example, current president, is that he gets a lot of face time on TV without it being sort of counted against him. He's just there making news, right? He's just making a speech, or he's shaking hands somewhere. So if others are running against him, they can't say, well, wait a second, in the news you showed President Obama doing this, I get to be shown. That's not quite the same thing. It's more if you're giving him time to make a speech. And then the last one, in addition to confidentiality and equal time, is right of reply. Again, if you make a statement against me, this applies again during campaigns. If you make a statement against me, I have the right to make a response. Well, this is how it works, but it's not as clear as even all that. There are all kinds of First Amendment issues. We're not going to have time in this course when we look at the First Amendment to talk about freedom of press, but there are some crucial issues in terms of what is the relationship of the press and this idea of freedom of the press. Does it mean that if you have freedom of the press, you do not have to reveal your sources? This is one that gets court case after court case, because sometimes somebody will print something that will have to do with maybe a crime, maybe some leak in the Pentagon or the CIA, and the newspaper writer or the television reporter who prints that doesn't want to say who it is that gave them that information, because the person who gave them that information is on the inside, and once they're revealed, they'll be fired and no longer able to give them that information. Do the courts have the right to make you reveal your sources? That is something that you'll get court case after court case over. Another one has to do with the right of access. Let's say, and this is where we'll talk about this in a little bit when we talk about the relationship between the different rights in the Bill of Rights, but you have the right to free speech, or to freedom of the press. You also have the right to a fair trial. Well, if giving the press access to all the pretrial proceedings so compromise the jury pool that now you can't get a free trial, or a fair trial rather. This is one of those things that can happen in those high-profile trials. Go back to, say, the O.J. Simpson trial or other trials of the century when they come up. If there is so much media about them, is there anybody really who's impartial and able to make a fair verdict? Or does everybody wind up getting biased one way or the other because of everything they've read in the papers? The newspapers would argue, media would argue, that we have the right to disinformation. Others would say, no, that's going to violate the opportunity for the accused to get a fair trial. The last one would have to do with access to information. Obviously, the press love to know. I think if you're a journalist, you have sort of an insatiable curiosity. I think that would be something that you would have, and is just part of your personality to be a great journalist. You just want to know. But are there things that people don't need to know? Going back to our conversation in Article 2 about executive privilege, does the president have the right to not tell you things? Does he have the right to say, I'm not going to tell you everything you need to know about the war on terror because you don't all need to know that? Is that something, or does the media say, hey, as the right of representing a democratic people, we have the right to tell them exactly what's going on? These are three different issues that the court cases deal with in terms of the media today.